Hey, this is Chad. Welcome to the High Floor Fantasy channel. This is our Week 5 wide receiver floor rating show. If you like this, go ahead and click on that subscribe button floating in the bottom right hand corner. And when you're done here, I'd really appreciate it if you go support me on Patreon. Go check it out over there. You get more stuff. So let's get right into the Week 5 wide receivers. Number 1, Cooper Kupp, LA Rams. He's been on fire, floor rating of 100. Over 23 points per game average. That is the highest among wide receivers. His 3-week average is just over 19 points, 19 fantasy points. His total is almost 120 fantasy points. His floor is just over 11 fantasy points, which he established in week 4. His ceiling is over 37 fantasy points, which he established in week 2. We've got some good news on the standard deviation here. We have a few guys who are in the green territory, which is we didn't see that with running backs, but unfortunately Cooper Kupp comes in with a standard deviation of 10.49, so he is orange, not quite so consistent. Still, however, number 1. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I had Woods. I have the Woods and Stafford stack. Although Robert Woods he's coming back now. So we'll see how long Cooper Kupp hangs on to this number 1 spot. Number 2, Davante Adams, Green Bay, floor rating of 92.40. Over 22 points per game average. He has the highest 3-week average, over 27 fantasy points. His floor is over 111 fantasy points, or excuse me, his total, boy, that would be great. His total is almost 112 fantasy points. His floor is not quite 11 fantasy points, which he established in week 1. You do like to see him establish the floor early, although it could change. He could have a worse week. But if your floor thus far was in week 1, that means you've just done better every week since then. His ceiling, these guys have some high ceilings. Over 37 fantasy points, which he established in week 5. His standard deviation is also in the orange at 11.76. Not so consistent. But number 2 there, Davante Adams, Green Bay. Number 3, Deebo Samuel, San Francisco. This is one of those ones where I have to say I was wrong. I stayed away from this offense. I didn't think I would see Deebo Samuel as the number 3 wide receiver after week 5. Floor rating of 91.66. Over 22 points per game average. 3-week average of over 20 fantasy points. Over 110 total points thus far. Floor of over 10 fantasy points, which he established in week 3. Ceiling of over 35 fantasy points, almost 36, which he established in week 4. Standard deviation in the orange, 11.35. There's Deebo Samuel at number 3. Number 4, Mike Williams, Los Angeles Chargers, floor rating 88.82. That offense, like both LA teams, man, I said this last week, I'm going to say it again. Both offenses are on fire. Mike Williams, okay, he's tied for average points per game with the next name on the list, number 5. We'll see that at just over 23 fantasy points per game average. 3-week average is almost 24 fantasy points, so he's trending up very slightly. He's also tied, now this is crazy, he's tied for total points year to date as well with the number 5 name. His floor, unfortunately, is just over 2 fantasy points. He established that in week 4. That is the lowest floor of all the wide receivers, or in the top 10. He established his floor in week 4, just over 2 fantasy points. His ceiling he established in week 5. Not quite 37 fantasy points. Again, orange standard deviation here, 13.46. So, see, these guys so far aren't very consistent, but we're going to see a trend upwards here in just a minute. So, the number 5 guy with all these ties I was telling you about, Tyreek Hill, Kansas. Floor rating of 88.21. Tied for average with Mike Williams, just over 23 fantasy points. 3-week average, just over 24 fantasy points. Tied for a total at just over 116 fantasy points. That's weird, man. You got tied for total and tied. Well, if your total is the same, your average is going to be the same. Floor of not quite 6 fantasy points, which he established in week 2. He has the highest ceiling of all of the wide receivers at almost 48 fantasy points. He established that in week 4. That was a great week if you had him. Unfortunately, with that low floor and that high ceiling, his standard deviation is red. That means it's the worst among all wide receivers. I'm giving you the top 75. If you go to Patreon, you get a lot more. You get more than the top 10s for sure. But his standard deviation, 18.13, least consistent. But number 5, Tyreek Hill. Number 6, Jamar Chase from Cincinnati. There's another name that I would not have thought of. I wasn't on that offense. I stayed away from pretty much New England, San Francisco, Philly, these guys, Cincinnati. Floor rating, 87.14. Average points per game, not quite 20 fantasy points per game. 3-week average of just over 21 fantasy points. Okay, now we got the first sub 100 total, just over 98 fantasy points total. Let's see, highest floor so far, over 13 fantasy points he established in week 2. Ceiling of not quite 28 fantasy points, which he established in week 5. And here's the good news. First one in the green standard deviation, 6.18. Very consistent player. That's why he's up at number 6. He's a guy you would want to have. Minnesota, Justin Jefferson. Floor rating, 86.69 after week 5. Just over 19 average points per game. 3-week average of over 22 points per game means he's trending up. Total, not quite 98 fantasy points. His floor is just over 12 fantasy points, which he established in week 1. Ceiling of just over, well, ceiling not quite 27 fantasy points, which he established in week 3. That means he's green on the standard deviation as well, 5.05. We got a couple green guys in a row here. Moving on, number 8, Marquise Brown, Baltimore, 85.76 floor rating. Over 20 fantasy points per game average. 3-week average of just over 20 as well. That's we'll look at his consistency in just a second. Over 103 total points, so we're back up to over 100 now. Floor of just over 8 fantasy points, which he established in week 3. Ceiling of just over 33 fantasy points, which he established in week 5. Unfortunately, orange standard deviation, 9.06. We've seen some, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the orange here in the top 10 wide receivers. All right, that's Marquise Brown, Baltimore, 85.76 floor rating after week 5. DJ Moore, Carolina, floor rating of 83. Not quite 20 points per game average, just over 20 points for a 3-week average. Total points, over 98 total points for the season. His floor is just over 9 points. He established his floor in week 5. Ceiling of almost 32 fantasy points. He established that in week 4. Standard deviation is yellow, 8.41. So not quite as consistent, but coming in number 9, DJ Moore. All right, here's one of my guys, DK Metcalf, floor rating of 81.33. Average points per game, just over 18. Actually, let's say closer to 19. 3-week average over 21 points per game for the last 3 weeks. Over 93 points total for the season. Floor of over 11 points, which he established in week 2. Ceiling of almost 27 points, which he established in week 5. And a green standard deviation. Finally, let's close it out on a good note there. 6.09 standard deviation for DK Metcalf coming in at number 10. All right. I appreciate it. If you like this, please click on that subscribe button and please consider going over to Patreon and supporting me. Hang out for another few seconds and you can click through to another couple of videos. You can learn more about the floor rating, or you can connect back to the running backs for week 5. Really appreciate that.